rain did not fall. It hung in the air like a cold, gray mist, clinging to the black umbrellas and soaking into the wool coats of the mourners gathered at the Arlington Annex. I stood at the edge of the artificial turf, staring blankly at the polished mahogany casket draped in the heavy, vibrant colors of the American flag. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, was supposed to be in that box. He was 78 years old, a decorated veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces who had served 3 tours in conflicts most people only read about in declassified history books. The official medical examiner's report stated it was a massive, sudden cardiac arrest. One moment he was tending to his prized heirloom tomatoes in the backyard, and the next, his heart simply gave out. It was a peaceful end for a man who had seen so much violence in his youth, or so the pastor kept repeating from the pulpit. But as the honor guard finished folding the flag into a crisp, immaculate triangle and handed it to my weeping mother, a chilling sensation crept up the back of my neck. It wasn't the damp wind, it was the absolute, uncharacteristic wrongness of it all. Grandpa Arthur was a man of meticulous, almost paranoid preparation. He had multiple backup generators, secondary communication lines, and a pantry stocked for a natural disaster. Dying suddenly without leaving a detailed binder of instructions on his desk felt entirely out of character. The crowd began to disperse, moving toward the line of idling black town cars. My mother, clutching the folded flag to her chest, was being guided away by my aunt. I hung back, needing a moment alone with the damp earth and the flowers. That was when Elias, the elderly funeral director who had managed the town's burials for 4 decades, stepped out from behind the canvas canopy. He didn't offer his usual practiced, comforting smile. His face was entirely pale, and his hands, usually steady, were trembling slightly. He stepped uncomfortably close to me, glancing over his shoulder toward the parking lot to ensure no one was watching. "Ma'am," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. "Thank you, Elias. It was a beautiful service," I replied softly, assuming he was simply offering his final condolences. He shook his head frantically, his eyes wide and terrified. He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his fingers cold through the sleeve of my black dress. "You don't understand," he hissed, his breath catching in his throat. That coffin is empty." I froze. The ambient noise of the cemetery, the engines starting, the muffled sobs, seemed to instantly drop away, leaving a ringing silence in my ears. "Are you crazy? What are you talking about? I saw the paramedics take him." "He paid me," Elias stammered, looking around wildly. 3 weeks ago, he walked into my office, handed me a sealed envelope with $20,000 in cash, and made me swear on my granddaughter's life that if anything ever happened to him, I would seal the casket before the viewing and bury it heavy. I put 80 pounds of sandbags in that mahogany box, Sarah. I swear to God there is no body in there. Before my brain could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of his words, Elias reached into his dark coat pocket and pressed a cold, heavy object into the palm of my hand. I looked down. It was an antique brass key, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. The number 7 was deeply engraved into the head of the key. "He told me to give this to you and only you the moment the dirt hit the grave," Elias whispered urgently. He said if they think he's dead, you might have a chance." "They? Who is they? Where is my grandfather?" I demanded, my voice rising. "I don't know," Elias pleaded, stepping backward. "Just listen to me. He said to tell you, don't dare to go home. Go to Vault 7. He said you would know where that is." My phone vibrated violently in my coat pocket, startling us both. Elias flinched, turned, and practically ran back toward his funeral parlor vehicle, leaving me standing alone by the open, empty grave. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled my phone out with trembling fingers. The screen lit up with a text message from my mother. "Mom, where are you? The cars are leaving. Don't go to Aunt Mary's for the reception. Come to the house alone. Right now." I stared at the glowing text. It made absolutely no sense. My mother was the ultimate matriarch. A funeral reception was sacred to her. She had spent the last 3 days cooking and organizing the family gathering. For her to suddenly cancel and demand I come to the empty family house alone was deeply, terrifyingly wrong. It didn't sound like her. The syntax was too short, too commanding. If they think he's dead, you might have a chance. Grandpa's warning echoed in my mind. He was a 78-year-old veteran with a mind sharper than broken glass. He didn't play games, and he didn't fabricate drama. If he had faked his own death and paid off the town undertaker, it meant the threat was not only real, it was lethal. And whatever that threat was, it was currently holding my mother's phone at our family home. I looked at the brass key in my hand. Vault 7. I knew exactly where it was. It wasn't a bank vault. When I was 10 years old, Grandpa used to take me to the old decommissioned armory downtown. In the basement, there was a row of heavy, reinforced storage lockers he rented under a shell corporation. He told me it was just for keeping the junk away from your grandmother, but he never let me see inside Vault 7. I didn't walk toward the town cars. I turned and walked quickly toward the rear gates of the cemetery, slipping out into the rainy streets. I flagged down a passing taxi, my clothes damp and my mind racing. "Where to, miss?" the driver asked, glancing at my funeral attire in the rear view mirror. "The old armory on 5th Street, I instructed, my voice surprisingly steady. "And please, take the back roads." The ride took 20 agonizing minutes. The old armory was a monolithic brick building, mostly abandoned and converted into a cheap self-storage facility. The front desk attendant barely looked up from his magazine as I walked past the lobby and descended the concrete stairs into the basement. The air down here smelled of dust, old iron, and damp concrete. The hallway was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent tubes. I walked past the rows of rusted metal doors until I reached the very end of the corridor. Vault 7. The door was heavier than the others, solid steel with a heavy brass padlock that looked entirely out of place on the modern latch. My hand shook as I inserted the brass key Elias had given me. It slid in perfectly. I turned it. The heavy internal tumblers clanked with a loud metallic thud. I pulled the heavy steel door open, expecting to find a stash of old military documents or perhaps a stash of emergency cash and passports. I reached blindly into the darkness and flicked the pull string for the overhead bulb. The harsh yellow light flooded the small, windowless concrete room. I gasped, stumbling backward against the hallway wall, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. There, sitting calmly in a worn leather armchair in the center of the vault, surrounded by a bank of glowing radio scanners and tactical maps pinned to the concrete walls, was Grandpa Arthur. He was wearing his old, faded, olive-drab military sweater. He wasn't dead. He didn't even look sick. He looked up at me, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine, his expression an unreadable mix of profound sorrow and grim determination. He reached over to the table beside him and picked up a heavy, matte black sidearm, checking the chamber with a practiced, terrifying fluidity. "Close the door, Sarah," my dead grandfather said, his voice steady and gravely. "We have less than 20 minutes before they realize your mother's text didn't work." I slammed the heavy steel door shut behind me, the rusted hinges shrieking against the damp concrete. The metallic thud of the latch engaging echoed in the small, windowless room, sealing us inside. I stood there, my black funeral dress clinging to my damp skin, my chest heaving as I stared at the ghost sitting in the worn leather chair. Grandpa Arthur didn't look like a man who had just suffered a massive, fatal cardiac arrest. He looked like a man preparing for a siege. The faded olive-drab sweater he wore was the same one he used to wear while fixing his old truck, but the context had violently shifted. The metal table beside him wasn't cluttered with gardening tools or crossword puzzles. It was covered in disassembled firearm components, a tactical radio transceiver, and a stack of encrypted hard drives. "You're dead," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I just watched an honor guard fold a flag for you. Mom is destroyed, Grandpa." She was sobbing over a box of sandbags. The stoic, unyielding mask on his weathered face cracked for a fraction of a second. His blue eyes, usually so bright and full of quiet humor, darkened with a profound, agonizing guilt. He slowly lowered the matte black sidearm onto the table and rested his rough, calloused hands on his knees. "I know, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion I had never heard him use before. Helplessness. "I watched the whole thing." He gestured toward the bank of glowing monitors on the back wall. I took a hesitant step closer. The screens weren't displaying weather patterns or news channels. They were live, high-definition surveillance feeds. One showed the Arlington Annex cemetery gates. Another showed the driveway of my mother's house. The third showed the interior of her living room. "You've been watching us?" I asked, a mix of betrayal and sheer confusion washing over me. "Why? Why would you put us through this? Why would you pay Elias to lie?" "Because if I didn't die on Tuesday, you and your mother would have been killed on Wednesday," he stated flatly. There was no hyperbole in his tone, just the cold, mathematical certainty of a soldier reading a casualty report. He stood up. Despite his 78 years, his movements were fluid, devoid of the arthritis and stiffness he had been complaining about for the last 5 years. It hit me then with a sickening realization. The limp, the complaining about his joints, the slow walks, it had all been an act. A camouflage to make the world think he was just a fragile old man. "Sit down, Sarah. We don't have much time, but you need to understand the board before we move our pieces," he commanded gently, pulling up a metal folding chair for me. I collapsed into it, my legs finally giving out. 40 years ago, before you were born, my unit was deployed to a black site outside of Bogota," Grandpa Arthur began, his eyes scanning. "The monitors. We were hunting a cartel liaison who was funneling weapons to paramilitary groups. But the man we were hunting wasn't local. He was an American contractor, a rogue asset named Silas Mercer. Mercer wasn't just selling guns. He was selling names, operatives, informants, their families. He didn't care who bled as long as his offshore accounts got heavy. He picked up a heavy brass compass from the table, turning it over in his hands as he spoke. We cornered him. The operation went bad. Mercer used a local family as human shields to break our perimeter. I made a call. I took the shot that put him down, but I didn't kill him. I shattered his spine. He was extracted, tried in a closed military tribunal, and sent to a federal supermax facility. I thought that was the end of it. I retired. I watched your mother grow up. I watched you graduate. I became Arthur Vance, the old man who grows tomatoes." He looked up at me, the grim reality settling into the deep lines of his face. 3 weeks ago, I went to the hardware store. When I came back to my truck, there was a single silver hollow-point bullet sitting on the driver's seat. Underneath it was a Polaroid picture. He reached into his pocket and slid a crumpled photograph across the metal table. I picked it up with trembling fingers. It was a picture of me and my mother, taken just last month at a coffee shop downtown. Someone had drawn a thick, red X over both of our faces. "Mercer got out," Grandpa Arthur said quietly. "Compassionate release, terminal cancer, they said. But a man like Silas doesn't spend his final days making peace with God. He spends them settling scores. He spent 40 years in a concrete box, dreaming about taking everything I loved before I took my last breath." The pieces slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. "So you faked the heart attack. He had a team watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike you and your mother to make me watch," Arthur explained, his voice hardening into steel. I couldn't fight ghosts in the open. If I went to the police, the feds, they would have tied us up in red tape while his mercenaries picked you off. I had to change the dynamic. I had to become a ghost myself. The moment I died, Mercer's entire plan fell apart. The man he wanted to torture was gone. His leverage vanished. "But the text," I said, my heart rate spiking again as I remembered the glowing screen of my phone. "Mom's text. She told me to come to the house alone." Arthur turned toward the monitors. The feed showing my mother's living room was eerily still. The front door was closed. The curtains were drawn. "Mercer's men are impatient," Arthur said, his jaw clenching. "With me gone, they shifted to their secondary objective, pure retaliation. They grabbed your mother when she got home from the cemetery. They sent that text to lure you in. They want to finish the bloodline." "We have to call the police," I yelled, reaching for my phone. "If they have her—" Grandpa Arthur's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with iron strength, stopping me instantly. "If a single squad car pulls into that driveway, they will put a bullet in her head before the tires stop rolling," he said, his eyes boring into mine with absolute terrifying authority. "Mercer's men are professionals. They have police scanners. They have lookouts on the perimeter. The authorities cannot save her, Sarah. Only we can." He let go of my wrist and turned to a heavy metal footlocker in the corner of the vault. He unlatched the heavy clasps and threw open the lid. Inside, resting on precision-cut foam, were 2 tactical Kevlar vests, a suppressed short-barreled rifle, and a row of loaded magazines. "I spent 40 years praying I would never have to open this box again," my grandfather whispered, pulling out one of the heavy black vests. He turned back to me, the old man who grew tomatoes entirely gone, replaced by the elite operator who had survived 3 wars. "I promised your grandmother I would protect this family," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vow as he tossed a set of encrypted car keys onto the table. "I intend to keep that promise. Are you ready to go get your mother back?" I stared at the heavy black Kevlar vest resting on the metal table. 30 minutes ago, my biggest concern was whether the catering hall had enough coffee for the grieving relatives. Now I was standing in a subterranean concrete bunker, watching a dead man check the action on a suppressed firearm. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but beneath the shock, a primal, undeniable instinct began to take root. My mother was sitting in the living room she had meticulously decorated, held hostage by ghosts from a war she didn't even know existed. I didn't argue. I didn't ask if we should reconsider. I stripped off my damp wool funeral coat, letting it drop to the dusty floor, and picked up the tactical vest. It was incredibly heavy, rigid with trauma plates. Grandpa Arthur stepped forward, his calloused hands moving with practiced efficiency as he tightened the Velcro straps over my black silk morning dress. The surreal contrast of tactical armor worn over funeral attire was not lost on him, but there was no time for irony. "Keep your head down. Stay exactly 2 paces behind my right shoulder, and if shooting starts, you drop to the floor and you do not move. Understood?" Arthur instructed, his voice a low, gravelly hum of absolute authority. He handed me a small, encrypted earpiece. "Put this in. If we get separated, push the button on your collar to transmit." "I understand," I replied, my voice shaking slightly but my hands steadying as the adrenaline burned away the last remnants of my grief. Arthur grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag and hit a secondary switch on the wall. The back of the vault didn't lead to a dead end. A section of the concrete paneling slid backward with a heavy pneumatic hiss, revealing a dark, sloped ramp leading down to an old loading bay. Parked in the shadows was a vehicle that looked nothing like the pristine sedan he usually drove to church. It was a late 90s Jeep Cherokee, painted entirely in matte black, stripped of all chrome, and resting on heavy-duty, reinforced suspension. We climbed in. The interior smelled of old canvas, gun oil, and stale ozone. Arthur engaged the ignition, and the engine purred to life with a quiet, modified hum that barely registered above a whisper. He didn't turn on the headlights. He pulled down a set of tactical night vision goggles mounted to the visor, navigating the service tunnel in complete darkness until we merged onto a desolate access road behind the armory. The rain was falling harder now, a torrential downpour that turned the evening sky into a bruised, charcoal gray. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers was the only sound in the cabin for the first 5 miles. I looked at the man driving, the hunched posture, the slow shuffle. The mild-mannered grandfather who complained about his tomatoes. It had all been a masterpiece of operational camouflage. "I thought you were just eccentric," I said quietly, the realization settling heavily in my chest. "All those years. The backup generators, the emergency drills you made us run when I was a kid. You told Mom it was for hurricane season." Arthur kept his eyes locked on the dark, rain-slicked road. "A man who makes enemies like Silas Mercer doesn't get the luxury of peace, Sarah. He only gets periods of waiting. Every lock I installed on that house, every security camera I disguised as a motion light, it was for today. I'm so deeply sorry you had to bury an empty box this morning. I am sorry your mother wept for me. But I had to break her heart to save her life. Grief can heal. A hollow point bullet cannot." The profound, agonizing weight of his love hit me like a physical blow. He had chosen to die in their eyes, to bear the pain of their mourning, from a surveillance monitor just to ensure they would draw another breath. "How are we getting in?" I asked, wiping a stray tear from my cheek and forcing my focus back to the tactical reality. "You said they have lookouts. Mom's house is in a cul-de-sac. It's a fatal funnel." "Only if you use the front door," Arthur replied grimly. He took a sharp turn onto a muddy logging road 2 miles from our neighborhood, cutting through the dense pine forest that bordered the back of our property line. "Do you remember when you were 12 and you asked why the basement smelled like wet concrete and epoxy for a month? You said you were fixing a foundation leak." "I was digging," he corrected, killing the engine as the Jeep coasted to a silent stop deep in the tree line. "I built a reinforced storm drain access point that connects directly to the space behind the wine cellar. It's a blind spot. It doesn't appear on any municipal blueprints. We stepped out into the freezing rain. The forest was pitch black, a chaotic symphony of wind and water. Arthur didn't need a flashlight. He moved through the dense, wet underbrush with the silent, predatory grace of an apex predator, returning to his hunting grounds. Carrying the suppressed rifle at the low ready, I followed exactly 2 paces behind his right shoulder, the wet mud instantly ruining my expensive black heels, the Kevlar vest tight against my ribs. We reached the edge of the tree line. Through the driving rain, I could see the back of my childhood home. It looked dark, quiet, and completely normal, but Arthur raised a small thermal monocular to his eye. "2 heat signatures in the kitchen," he whispered, his voice crackling softly in my earpiece. "1 in the hallway. 1 in the living room with your mother." He guided me down into a steep, muddy ravine that acted as a natural runoff creek. The freezing water soaked through my dress up to my knees, but I didn't make a sound. We waded through the muck until we reached a heavy, rusted iron drainage grate hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown blackberry bushes. Arthur reached into the muddy water, felt for a concealed mechanical latch, and pulled. The heavy grate swung open silently on oiled hinges. We crawled into the dark, narrow concrete pipe. The smell of wet earth was overwhelming. After 30 feet, the pipe opened up into a small, dry sub-basement chamber. Above our heads, I could see the wooden floorboards of my mother's wine cellar. Arthur reached up and unlatched a disguised access panel in the ceiling. He pushed it open just an inch. The faint, warm glow of the hallway lighting spilled down into the dark chamber, illuminating the grim, lethal focus on my grandfather's face. But it wasn't the light that made my blood run cold. It was the sound filtering through the floorboards. It was the smell of my mother's familiar lavender laundry detergent mixed with the terrifying muffled sound of her sobbing. "I swear to you, I don't know what you're talking about," my mother's voice pleaded, trembling with raw terror. A cold, distinctly professional male voice answered her. The sound of a heavy chair scraping across the hardwood floor echoed above us. "Arthur Vance didn't leave a fortune in a bank, Helen," the man said smoothly, his boots pacing right above our heads. "He left a ledger, a list of accounts Silas wants back. Your father is dead. The theatrical mourning period is over. Now, you are going to tell me exactly where he hid the safety deposit keys, or I'm going to start breaking your fingers one by one until you remember." In the dark sub-basement, Grandpa Arthur looked at me. The gentle old man was entirely gone. In his eyes was the absolute, unyielding wrath of a soldier about to rain hell upon the men who dared to threaten his daughter. He silently raised the suppressed rifle, placing his hand flat against the trap door. The floorboards groaned in the living room above us as the mercenary shifted his weight. Distinct metallic click of a heavy pair of steel pliers unlatching echoed through the thin wood. My mother let out a terrified, muffled sob, the sound of a woman bracing for excruciating pain. Grandpa Arthur did not hesitate. The gentle, tomato-growing retiree was a fabricated ghost. The man standing in the subterranean dark was a Tier 1 operator executing a rescue. He held up 3 fingers, his eyes locking onto mine in the dim light. 3, 2, 1. He pushed the disguised access panel upward with explosive, silent force. The heavy wooden trapdoor, seamlessly integrated into the wine cellar floor, swung back on oiled hinges. Arthur surged upward with terrifying speed, a lifetime of lethal muscle memory completely overriding the stiff joints of a 78-year-old man. He cleared the lip of the cellar, bringing the suppressed rifle to his shoulder in a single, fluid motion. I scrambled up the wooden rungs immediately behind him, my Kevlar vest scraping against the tight, opening, the adrenaline turning my blood to ice. We emerged from the pantry and stepped into the softly lit hallway of my childhood home. Framed family photos lined the walls, pictures of my graduations, holiday dinners, and a smiling Grandpa Arthur. Now, the subject of those photos was gliding past them like a heavily armed phantom. Arthur rounded the corner into the living room. The mercenary had his back to us. He was a large man wearing tactical gear, his hand gripping my mother's wrist, forcing it flat against the glass coffee table. He raised the steel pliers. "Last chance, Helen," the man growled. "Step away from my daughter." Arthur's voice cut through the room. It wasn't a yell. It was a cold, gravelly command that dropped the temperature in the room to freezing. The mercenary froze. He turned his head, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock as he looked at the man he had been told was currently lying in a sealed mahogany casket under 80 pounds of sandbags. For a fraction of a second, the psychological paralyzation of seeing a dead man standing in the hallway overrode his tactical training. That fraction of a second was all Arthur needed. Phut! Phut! The suppressed rifle coughed twice. The mercenary dropped to the hardwood floor instantly, the steel pliers clattering uselessly against the glass table. My mother screamed, a raw, visceral sound of pure terror, pressing herself back into the sofa. She looked at the dead man on her rug, and then her wide, tear-streaked eyes slowly moved up to the doorway. She stopped breathing. The color drained from her face completely. "Dad," she whispered, her voice fracturing. Her mind simply could not process the geometry of the room. She had just returned from Arlington. She had the folded flag resting on the mantel behind her. "Dad, how?" Arthur lowered the rifle slightly, his eyes softening with an agonizing surge of paternal love. "I'm here, Nellie. I'm so sorry. I've got you." But the emotional reunion was violently cut short. The heavy thud of the mercenary hitting the floor hadn't gone unnoticed. Shouts erupted from the kitchen. The distinct, terrifying sound of automatic weapons being charged echoed down the hallway. The 2 heat signatures Arthur had spotted earlier were converging on our position. "Sarah, get her!" Arthur roared, the soft father vanishing instantly as he pivoted toward the hallway, raising the rifle and putting himself squarely between the incoming threat and his family. I sprinted across the living room, my muddy boots slipping on the polished hardwood. I grabbed my mother's arm. She was completely frozen in a state of clinical shock, staring at her father. "Mom, we have to go, right now!" I yelled, pulling her off the sofa with every ounce of strength I had. "He's dead, Sarah. He died," she mumbled, her legs refusing to support her weight. "He lied to save us. Move!" I physically dragged her toward the wine cellar just as the hallway erupted into blinding violence. Deafening gunfire shattered the pristine quiet of the suburban house. The drywall exploded outward in clouds of white dust and jagged splinters. Framed photos shattered, raining glass down on the carpet. The mercenaries were laying down heavy, suppressing fire, tearing the hallway to shreds. Arthur didn't flinch. He used the heavy oak door frame as cover, returning fire with methodical, terrifying precision. Phut, phut, phut. A man screamed in the kitchen, followed by the sound of a heavy body crashing into the kitchen island. "One down! Get to the cellar!" Arthur commanded over the deafening roar of the assault rifles, reloading his weapon with a blindingly fast tactical reload. I pushed my mother into the pantry. She stumbled, finally realizing the lethal reality of the situation, and scrambled toward the open trapdoor. I helped her lower herself into the dark, damp hole. "Go down! Keep going until you hit the pipe," I ordered, turning back to look at the hallway. The 3rd mercenary, heavily armored, kicked the kitchen door completely off its hinges. He raised an assault rifle, leveling it directly at Grandpa Arthur's exposed flank. "Grandpa, left side!" I screamed. Arthur pivoted, but he was a fraction of a second too late. The mercenary fired. A 3-round burst tore through the living room. 1 round shattered the mantel clock. The second buried itself in the sofa. The 3rd round hit Grandpa Arthur square in the chest. The impact threw the 78-year-old veteran backward. He hit the hardwood floor hard, his rifle clattering out of his grip and sliding across the room out of reach. The armored mercenary stepped into the living room, advancing slowly, keeping his weapon trained on the old man bleeding on the rug. My mother screamed from the cellar below. I stood at the edge of the trapdoor wearing the heavy Kevlar vest my grandfather had given me. I looked at the black sidearm he had tucked into my waistband back in the vault. I had never fired a gun in my life. But the man on the floor had given up his life, his identity, and his peace to protect us. I was not going to let him die on my mother's living room floor. I drew the weapon. The heavy, matte black sidearm felt completely foreign in my trembling hands. I didn't know the proper stance. I didn't know breath control. I only knew that the armored mercenary standing in my mother's shattered living room was about to execute the man who had just sacrificed his entire existence to save us. The mercenary stepped forward, his boots crunching on the broken glass, his assault rifle locking onto Grandpa Arthur's fallen body. He didn't even notice me standing in the shadows of the open pantry, shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. I gripped the gun with both hands, squeezed my eyes half shut against the anticipated blast, and pulled the heavy trigger. The explosion in the enclosed hallway was deafening. The recoil snapped my wrists upward violently, sending the first shot wild into the ceiling, raining plaster down on the hardwood. But the sheer volume of the blast caused the mercenary to flinch and pivot toward the pantry. I pulled the trigger again and again. I didn't stop firing until the slide locked back with a hollow metallic click. Through the dense cloud of white drywall dust and the acrid, burning smell of cordite, the mercenary staggered backward. He dropped his rifle, his hands flying to the unarmored gap at his collarbone. He collapsed against the ruined hallway wall, sliding down to the floor, motionless. The silence that followed was the heaviest, most terrifying sound I had ever experienced. The ringing in my ears was a high-pitched whine. I dropped the empty gun. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. "Grandpa!" I screamed, my voice tearing through my raw throat. I scrambled out of the pantry, falling to my knees beside the old man. My mother crawled up from the wine cellar right behind me, her face pale, her hands covered in dust and mud. She threw herself onto the floor next to us, sobbing hysterically as she looked at the bullet hole torn through the center of his olive-drab sweater. "Dad, no, please, Dad, stay with us," my mother begged, pressing her hands against his chest, trying to stop a bleeding she couldn't see. Grandpa Arthur groaned. It was a deep, wet sound that terrified me. His eyes fluttered open, staring up at the ceiling. He coughed, wincing violently. Slowly, agonizingly, his large, calloused hand moved up to his chest. He grabbed the torn fabric of his sweater and pulled it apart. Underneath the wool was the thick, rigid black Kevlar of a heavy trauma plate, buried dead center in the composite material. Smoking slightly and warped beyond recognition was the 5.56 round. It hadn't penetrated. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath, his chest heaving as he looked from the embedded bullet to his daughter's tear-streaked face. "3 fractured ribs, at least," he wheezed, a faint, exhausted smile cracking through the grim lines of his face. He looked over at me, his eyes shining with a mixture of absolute pride and profound relief. "I told you to stay 2 paces behind my right shoulder, Sarah. Not bad for a civilian." My mother collapsed against him, burying her face in his shoulder, sobbing not out of terror, but out of the sheer, overwhelming realization that her father was alive. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly amidst the ruins of her living room. "I'm sorry, Nellie," he whispered into her hair, his own tears finally mixing with the dust on his face. "I am so sorry for the pain I caused you today. But I couldn't let them take my girls. I just couldn't." We didn't run. The threat was neutralized. Arthur painfully sat up and reached into his tactical vest, pulling out a heavily encrypted satellite phone. He dialed a short sequence of numbers. He didn't call 911. He called the ghosts he used to work with. "It's Vance," Arthur spoke into, the receiver, his voice returning to that low, gravelly authority. "I have a cleanup required at my primary residence. 3 of Silas Mercer's assets are down, and you can tell the director to stop dragging his feet. Mercer violated his compassionate release. I want federal marshals at his hospice bed in 10 minutes, or I swear to God I will come out of retirement and finish the job I started 40 years ago." The Arlington Cemetery eventually corrected their ledger, quietly removing the 80 pounds of sandbags from the Vance family plot. The federal authorities swept through the house that night, scrubbing the scene and quietly transferring Silas Mercer from his private medical facility back into a subterranean supermax cell, where he would spend his final days staring at a concrete wall, knowing he had failed. 6 months later, the drywall in the hallway was repaired. The shattered photos were replaced with new ones. It was a Sunday morning. The sunlight streamed warmly through, the kitchen windows smelling of brewing coffee and frying bacon. My mother was standing at the stove, humming softly to herself. I was sitting at the table, a mug of tea in my hands, feeling a profound, quiet peace that had been absent from our lives for a very long time. I looked out the window into the backyard. Grandpa Arthur was out there. He was wearing his old, faded sweater, moving a little slower now because of the healed ribs. He knelt in the dirt, carefully tying a heavy green vine to a wooden stake. He wasn't watching the perimeter. He wasn't listening to tactical scanners. He was just an old man finally free from the shadows, growing his heirloom tomatoes in the sun. He looked up, caught me watching him through the glass, and offered a warm, bright smile. He didn't have to be a ghost anymore. He was just my grandfather, and that was exactly where he belonged. If you were at your grandfather's funeral and the undertaker slipped you a brass key and whispered that the Coffin was completely empty. What would you do? Would you call the police and risk everything? Or would you follow the instructions and step into a hidden world to save your family? Sometimes, the greatest lies are told by the people who love us the most, simply to keep us safe in the dark. Let me know if you would forgive your family for a secret this massive in the comments below. If you love this story of family, sacrifice, and survival, drop a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.